Gothic is a sturdy word, a dark word, a groan of a word. I've been fascinated with the Gothic ever since teenage angst made me turn my fingernails, hair, eyes, clothes and lips a kaleidoscope of black. But I suspect there might be more to the Gothic than a dingy dress sense and a miserable outlook. So I'm going on a journey, a quest to discover what Gothic literature and culture really is. What could Robert Louis Stevenson and Mary Shelley possibly have in common with 1950s science fiction films and Susie and the Banshees? I live in Glasgow, a place some folk have nicknamed Gotham. The soot might have been cleaned from the tenements, but this is still a Gothic city full of the most amazing Victorian architecture. I'm starting this Gothic quest in the most Gothic part of this Gothic city, the Necropolis, Glasgow's first hygienic cemetery, established in the 1830s, designed to stop the slippage of corpses from ill-dug graves that was becoming a city scandal. Apparently 50,000 people are buried here, and that's only the ones we know of. The necropolis is a convenient walk across the Bridge of Sighs from the Royal Infirmary, and you can't help but pity poor patients who have it as their view. It dominates the skyline, providing a backdrop that wouldn't be out of place in a Hammer horror movie, a silhouette of lopsided crosses and half-tumbled monuments. Turn your head and you'll see weeping women, angelic children and stern stalwarts at the church. It's a bit spooky. This is a spectacular place, a city of the dead. The Glasgow necropolis embodies everything I think of as Gothic. It's dramatic, morbid, decaying yet beautiful. It can also be a dangerous place, somewhere you shouldn't go after dark. But am I right? Is this what the Gothic is all about?
I suppose one of the interesting and curious features of the Gothic is that it's very difficult to answer questions about its origins.
Professor David Punter of Bristol University. He's the man who first put Gothic literature on the academic map.
But when we actually think about Gothic, then we think, I suppose, about, firstly, medieval cathedrals, secondly, about the wave of interest in the Gothic in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which is when the whole notion of Gothic fiction and Gothic literature became of importance. We then think on, of course, to the Gothic revival in the 19th century, the Victorian Gothic revival, which has given us masterpieces like the Houses of Parliament, for example. But one of the features of the Gothic is that it seems, to date, endlessly capable of remaking itself, so that one now gets a great deal of fiction which is regarded as Gothic, one gets a notion of Goth culture, and one gets, of course, the endless remakings of Gothic motifs in film, including motifs like the vampire, like Frankenstein's monster, and so forth.
The first Gothic novel is generally credited as Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, constantly in print since 1764. The plot of Otranto figures an ancestral curse which must be lifted, but which results in all sorts of spooky goings-on. There's foul weather, secret passages, long corridors, frightening apparitions, wicked tyrants, distressed heroines, and endless scenes of flight. Otranto is almost a template for the Gothic. I asked David Punter what motivated Walpole to write something so unlike anything that had gone before.
Well, Walpole's motives are difficult, I think, to unearth. It's probable that Walpole wanted serious literary credibility, but he was also a bit of a joker. I think that what Walpole seems to have thought was that there was a way of writing which would not follow directly in the realist steps of the major 18th century authors, which would involve the genre which he called romance and which we might now prefer to call fantasy. And in Castle of Otranto, he clearly set about attempting to do that.
Little did he know what he was starting. It struck me that a lot of the effects Walpole employed are common to Scottish literature, and I wondered if there was a peculiarly Scottish strain of the genre. I met Owen Dudley Edwards, reader in history at Edinburgh University, at Sir Walter Scott's lodgings in the capital's George Square. We sat in the front room of the beautifully preserved townhouse, and Owen introduced me to Scott's proud Maisie, a young woman anticipating marriage, who finds herself participating in a much sadder church service.
Proud Maisie is in the wood, walking so early. Sweet robin sits on the bush, singing so rarely. Tell me, thou bonny bird, when shall I marry me? When 6 broad gentlemen kirkward shall carry ye. Who makes the bridal bed, birdie, say truly? The grey-headed sexton that delves the grave duly. The glow-worm more grave and stone shall light thee steady. The owl from the steeple sing, welcome, proud lady. Walter Scott lived here in the mid-1790s. He had been born in 1771 and, of course, would have been a student at Edinburgh University in the 1780s. While Scott was being trained in becoming a great historian according to the most modern principles of our time, he also had learned, as a boy who had been crippled in his youth, how to listen to older people, and had accumulated a fascinating amount of information on the way people dressed in the past, the status of women, the role of the family, the way in which various stories are preserved, and those stories themselves, superstitions, magic, a lot of the things that we call Gothic nowadays.
Do you think there were any other factors that made him move towards Gothicness?
I think we could put it this way. Part of Scott and part of Scotland, and in a certain way part of much of the world of that time, went through in the 18th century a profoundly rational experience of people accumulating knowledge for its own sake, people wanting to divorce themselves from what they called superstition, which very often meant religion, people constantly thinking of science, the tremendous advances in the School of Medicine which made Edinburgh the greatest medical centre in the world. And yet at the same time you have what I might call the undertow. A sensitive person like Scott, so much aware of folklore and so on, can see the very fact that there is being so much scientific advance means that there's a great danger of a good deal being lost. So at the same time as you have an enlightenment, and sometimes within the same people, there's the anxiety to embrace what the Enlightenment is throwing out. Old stories, strange beliefs, irrational ways of proceeding. And so that you have the development of a Gothic culture, partly in very rational figures like Horace Walpole, nevertheless writing his Castle of Otranto as Gothic as you can get. And Scott himself is fascinated by this duality, and so when his time comes to be both a collector and a writer, he wants, certainly, to see progress in Scotland, but he also wants to celebrate that which may be dying. And as you're trying to celebrate old forms of fiction and storytelling and so forth, it necessarily becomes both a bit artificial and a bit dotty.
To me, Edinburgh has always been a city that I associate with the Gothic. I think it's perhaps a combination of the architecture, the dark wines, maybe a little bit to do with the weather and the kind of dryness of the humour that we have here. Do you think Edinburgh will lose its Gothic charm with the modernisation that's going on, especially around the Scottish Parliament? Do you think Gothic will remain?
There are things which are greater than modern architecture, like lots and lots of things. One of them is, of course, the fact that we have the mountain rising behind it, Arthur's Seat, so that it could conceivably be the very place where King Arthur is still alive with his knights in that long sleep, which will continue on until the moment when somebody goes into that cave and sounds the bell, and when the knight wakes up and says, "Is it time?" the speaker will say, "Yes," and King Arthur will rise, and the day of judgment has dawned. Now, with that going on, or as the case is not going on, behind the Scottish Parliament, I'm all for the Scottish Parliament. I rejoice in it very much. But the fact that they are dwarfed by a marvellous legend, by a whole series of visible signs of what centred humanity on folklore, upon mythical past and so on, the Scottish Parliament is bound to become Gothic too, quite apart from the fact that quite a number of speeches there will be Gothic in their own right.
The Gothic spirit of Edinburgh pervades the work of a later writer, Robert Louis Stevenson. His story The Body Snatchers was inspired by the truly grim exploits of Burke and Hare. They provided a regular supply of exceedingly fresh cadavers to Dr. Robert Knox, one of the leading anatomists of 1820s Edinburgh. It was a profitable if grisly business, and the pair murdered 16 victims before finally being uncovered. Owen Dudley Edwards took me to the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh and led me through glass cases displaying skeletons and body parts to Burke and Hare Corner. We stood in front of the death mask of William Burke, and Owen read to me from The Body Snatchers. Here a student anatomist is confronted in the depths of night by a very dead, very familiar body.
Fetters, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as they stripped the sack from their sad merchandise, he leaned dozing with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer with the candle raised. "God Almighty!" he cried. "That is Jane Galbraith!" The men answered nothing, but they shuffled nearer the door. "I know her, I tell you," he continued. "She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible she can be dead. It's impossible you should have got this body fairly." In front of the plaster cast from Burke's death mask is to be found a pocketbook, which has been made of Burke's skin, because after he had been found guilty and was sentenced to be hanged, and duly was hanged, under the law then existing, the body of a murderer was to be handed over to the Professor of Anatomy of the University of Edinburgh for dissection before his class as a warning to all future criminals in the time coming.
Wow. And Edinburgh is a very scientific city. You've already mentioned its connection with doctors and anatomy, and this is at the heart of the Gothic. Why do you think that science is so important to Gothic literature?
Well, it's very crucial, isn't it? One of the essential points, I think we have to say, is that science derives originally from magic. So that role, therefore, of magic in the making of science is something that comes back to haunt the Gothic, because we're still partly thinking of what is happening as magic. And when a doctor executes a miracle cure, we still vaguely think it has something to do with magic.
Stevenson's work is steeped in science and medicine. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde takes us to another dissecting theatre, the laboratory where Dr. Jekyll conducts his strange experiments.
Here we come into the fact that in the 1840s, James Young Simpson, the Professor of Midwifery of Edinburgh, made the tremendous advance that chloroform applied to women in the course of childbirth will greatly ease the pains. Now, Simpson, to do this, did what the medical doctors did in Edinburgh. He experimented on himself. They all did that sort of thing. And he took his first whiff of chloroform with the words, "This will revolutionize modern science," and fell on the floor, apparently a corpse. And then revived, tried it on some of his assistants, brought in the family. They even had tea and chloroform parties in his part of the new town, and then they decided that it could go on the market. Stevenson, although not born until 1850, became a great friend of the young Simpsons. And that's why the Jekyll and Hyde case is so scientific, because it's really talking about old Simpson having apparently separated body and soul for a time, and the next stage is separating good from evil. And that's why Oscar Wilde was so absolutely right when he said, "The experiment of Dr. Jekyll reads dangerously like a case in the Lancet."
The next step of my journey took me to London and another medical institution. I met the novelist Sarah Waters at the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel. The streets in this part of the East End were dark and dangerous in Victorian times, the haunt of Jack the Ripper and Dorian Gray, and some of that atmosphere still lingers. Sarah led me along the Royal London's echoing corridors to the crypt below the hospital chapel, where she read me a passage from her novel, Fingersmith. It's 1860, and Maud Lily has been tricked into an asylum.
They carried me along a passage through a set of doors and a room, then to a landing, another passage, another room. I tried to study the way, but they had me on my back. I could make out only so many drab-coloured ceilings and walls. After about a minute, I knew they'd got me deep into the house and that I was lost. I could not cry out. The nurse kept her arm about my throat, and I still had the spoon of horn in my mouth. When we reached a staircase, they took me down it, saying, "To you, Mr. Bates, and watch this turn, it's a tight one," as if I might be not a sack of feathers now, but a trunk or a piano. Not once did they look me in the face. Finally, one of the men began to whistle a tune and to beat out the time of it with his finger ends on my leg. When I think about the Gothic, I do think of it as, for a start, a series of interiors. It's very much, for me, an interior world. And it's very much, I think about individuals being drawn into sort of large structures like hospitals, prisons, asylums, in my work, and sort of Gothic country houses. I mean, that's the traditional image we have, I suppose, of the Gothic, is a figure, most commonly a woman, wandering around, you know, with a candle in a dark passage at night in a rather sort of a sinister, oppressive mansion, I guess. I mean, that's, I suppose, was at the start of Gothic in novels like The Castle of Otranto and things. I mean, it's no coincidence, I suppose, that, as far as I understand it, you know, the Gothic novel rose and sort of became established from the end of the 18th century onwards through the 19th century, and that was exactly a time in which, you know, people were very seriously thinking about how to build great institutions that could accommodate vast numbers of people in ways that did really dehumanise them. And at the same time, you know, hospitals, I think, were designed and are still, unfortunately, rather designed to dehumanise people. That's what's so scary about going into hospital, that you feel very small and you feel all your sort of individuality and humanity is being sort of taken away from you. That's precisely what's frightening about them.
Yeah, and that monumentalism of the buildings as well, it makes us feel really tiny.
The pull of the Gothic is that it takes you to this place of fear. You know, it goes beyond all those official sort of stories about the self and about identity and our place within the family and society. And the Gothic, I think, allows us to articulate all these fears and anxieties and tensions that underlie the sort of official institutions of our society.
Yeah. Do you think this feeling of powerlessness that we express a lot in the Gothic, the running away, the heroine in crisis, I suppose, which is a main convention at the centre of the genre, do you think it really is something that pertains to women specifically, or more to women?
I think the idea of vulnerability is at the heart of the Gothic, and I think it is something that applies to male and female characters, but has lent itself to sort of writings about femininity, and perhaps for that reason has been very attractive to women writers. You know, women writers were there at the start of the genre, people like Anne Radcliffe and Clara Reeve, and then Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein and the Brontes. And I think in this century, you know, lots of female writers have felt very at home in the Gothic. Angela Carter, Anne Rice, and I feel very at home in the Gothic, and I think it is because it allows women writers to look very specifically at tensions around femininity and the family and maternity, all those institutions. Again, it always comes back to, you know, the idea of the institution. I think that the physical institutions of Gothic fiction often, I think, stand in for social and cultural institutions that people have to sort of operate in the world. But for women, I think more than for men, there's a lot more scope for feeling afraid of. I mean, Frankenstein talks about the horrors of maternity. I mean, there are no women in it, hardly any women in it, and yet it seems to me to be very much about the horrors and traumas of giving birth and being a parent.
It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs.
I think that Gothic imagery is everywhere when we think now about scientific and technological discoveries.
David Punter again.
You read tabloid headlines talking about monsters being created through genetic manipulation, and it does go back to Frankenstein, and I think Probably not before that. Unusually in the Gothic, one can say that that was a really originating text, I think. That Frankenstein myth, that notion of something getting out of control, getting beyond human control, we can see it now, of course, also in the fears of nanotechnology, in the way in which these fears are being recounted in terms of anxiety about what the tabloids again call a grey mass. Perhaps scientists call it that too, for all I know, I'm not sure. But that grey mass seems to me to be the blob. I mean, from a 1950s science fiction movie, the scary thing is being taken over by something out of your control, and something which is no longer, and this I think is crucial, no longer individuated. But this fear of being invaded, this fear of being taken over by something that's out with human or state control, I think is there since Mary Shelley came at that text.
So Frankenstein's monster is an abandoned, malformed child, horrifying yet evoking of sympathy. The Gothic often shows compassion to its monsters. It's also a barometer of attitudes towards outsiders, and from Psycho to Buffy is regularly the gay and transgendered who are monstered. Sarah Waters again.
I think at the heart of Gothic there's always been an enjoyment, a sort of relish of otherness and deviance. My introduction to the Gothic was probably through Hammer horror films in the 70s that I used to watch a lot of as a child. The wonderful thing about horror films is that they have their sequel sort of lurking inside them, you know what I mean? You can never get rid of the monsters in horror films. They'll always re-emerge in the next film. So Frankenstein's monster can always be brought back to life, or Dracula will end up in a block of ice and be able to be thawed out or something. So I think they're amazing testimonies to the resilience of deviance. And I think for that reason, the Gothic has always been a place where lesbians and gay men and other sorts of deviants, for want of a better word, feel very much at home. And certainly lots of things at the heart of the Gothic, for example, a sort of suspicion of the family and an awareness that family life is often kind of sinister or menacing, or models of femininity and masculinity and gender and sexuality, that there's more to these things than is officially allowed for in our culture. I mean, those are ideas that lesbians and gay men, are very sort of at home with and at ease with. Queers of all kinds, have a real kind of affinity with the monsters of Gothic.
There are many different forms of monstering. Best-selling novelist Patrick McGrath is also concerned with exploring the role of others and outsiders. Patrick read to me from his novel Martha Peake, set in 1774. Here, poverty forces Martha's disabled father Harry to exhibit his broken body in a tavern, an act he performs with dignity and defiance.
Harry's face was powdered to an unnatural chalky whiteness, and his eyes were blacked with coal, so they seemed in the candle flame terrifying caves of darkness, with the merest pinprick of light blazing deep within. It made a haunting spectacle. He seemed something from a dream or from the realm of the vampires. Harry, still with his back to the audience, threw off his coat and opened his shirt and pushed it off his shoulders, and they glimpsed in the gloom the strange bony formations, the peaks and ridges that had lifted and skewed his spine and pushed his shoulders awry, such that his upper torso was a horribly bent and broken thing.
Patrick's father was the chief medical officer at Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane, and Patrick told me that some of his earliest friends were the inmates. I asked him, was this an ideal childhood for a Gothic novelist?
There was a superficial aspect of it where my father enjoyed the rather macabre aspect of his work and did like to tell stories that were morbid and perverse, and did so with relish and black humour. So I certainly acquired an affection for the morbid and the perverse and the macabre at a very early age. But at the same time, he was deeply serious and committed to his work as a psychiatrist, and insanity was explained within very much a medical paradigm.
Patrick's work is full of altered states. Not just madness, but drunkenness, dreams and drugs as well. It's a condition that plagues the genre.
What the Gothic is often doing is subverting anything at all that's established. I think that if we come to the realm of sort of logic and reason and the ability to think clearly and see things straight, the Gothic is very impatient and even, derisive of the very project of seeing things straight. The Gothic is far more interested in the the disturbed mind than in the clear mind. The Gothic sort of pivots on a point round about 1840, thereabouts, when Poe comes along and says, in effect, it's not the external structures that anymore sort of contain this sort of horror and ambiguity and strangeness and constriction and duplicity. It's the mind itself. So the Gothic sort of moves inwards, becomes subjective.
Do you think it's also a genre that we can have a lot of fun with?
Well, it's an old genre. It's very well developed. It's been around for more than 200 years. So once a genre has been around that long, it's acquired a great many mannerisms, which makes it very easy to parody or pastiche. And in those early days, as a Gothic writer, I was just having fun, taking the conventions of the genre and playing with them. Mm-hmm. And it's terribly easy to do, because we're so familiar with, the gloomy house and the vulnerable maiden and the wicked aristocrat and the funny noises in the cellar or the attic and so forth. There's a vast sort of repertoire of Gothic motifs which you can just bring on and then have, it just takes a little bit of exaggeration to have sort of great, glorious fun.
The American Gothic writer Edgar Allan Poe is behind Lou Reed's recent album, The Raven. Just another indication of the way Gothic continually reinvents itself.
These are the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, not exactly the boy next door. Tell you tales of heart and he'll play with your mind. If you haven't heard of him, you must be dead or blind.
On this part of my quest, I've discovered that Gothic is as resilient as any creeping corpse. It's a dark genre, concerned with death, madness, altered states, scientific abuses and outsiders, yet it doesn't take itself too seriously. Next week, in the second part of my quest, I'll be visiting vampiric Whitby, meeting some real goths, exploring the basement of the St Pancras Hotel, and consorting with a very special vicar.
These are the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, not exactly the boy next door.
The smooth, pure line of her neck was bare. His breath was sweet with the stench of the grave. His face loomed down.
So, I'm sitting in the graveyard in Whitby at the top of the East Cliff, looking down into the sea, and you can really see why Bram Stoker chose this as a setting for Dracula. Climb the 199 steps and you'll find yourself in an amazing Victorian graveyard in the shadow of Whitby's ruined abbey. And from here you can get the perfect view of the harbour where Dracula arrives in the middle of a storm, swept in on a ghostly ship, unsteered but for the hand of a dead man. But I would think that it's not just Bram Stoker that makes Whitby into a Gothic place. For a long time this has been a place where jet jewellery's been made, something that experienced a boom after the death of Prince Albert when the cult of mourning became established, and there was a fad for all things black. And let's face it, even if you're in mourning, a girl's got to have her jewellery. It's a beautiful day, and to be honest, it doesn't seem very Gothic at the moment. The sun's out and people are walking about eating ice creams. The place is full of day trippers. But come here at night and you'll find it's a different story, as Mina does when she goes in search of Lucy and Bram Stoker's Dracula, and she climbs the 199 steps to the graveyard after dark.
Time and distance seemed endless, and my knees trembled, and my breath came laboured as I toiled up the endless steps to the abbey. I must have gone fast, and yet it seemed to me as if my feet were weighted with lead, as though every joint in my body were rusty. When I got almost to the top, I could see the seat and the white figure, for I was now close enough to distinguish it, even through the spells of shadow. There was undoubtedly something long and black, bending over the half-reclining white figure. I called in fright, "Lucy! Lucy!" And something raised a head, and from where I was, I could see a white face and red, gleaming eyes.
Welcome, foolish mortals, to the Dracula experience. Walk carefully. Do not run. To run implies a chase. Do not stop too long. That may imply the chase is over. After traveling to Castle Dracula in Transylvania, Jonathan Harker is held prisoner by the hypnotic charms of Dracula's female vampires. Meanwhile, Dracula plots to take over the soul of Jonathan's fiancée, Mina. He lures Mina's friend Lucy to the tomb of a suicide, and then recruits her to his legion of vampires. Finally, at the snow-covered Borgo Pass in Transylvania, they catch up with Dracula's coach. Jonathan Harker wields his kukri knife and severs Dracula's head. It seems Dracula's reign of terror is over. What do you think?
I've just survived Whitby's Dracula experience, and I must say it's truly terrifying. I've got all those signifiers of anxiety and scarediness. My heart's beating a bit faster, and I've got the sweaty palms, and I had to run for the door. And it's just fantastic. And this is the seaside manifestation of Bram Stoker's great novel, and I wonder if he ever knew it would end up this way. Really, it's a haunted house. It's like something you would find in a fairground. And at the most terrifying moment, somebody leaps out and grabs you. It's just too much. It's another side of the Gothic. The Gothic is not a genre that takes itself too seriously. And I think the thing we have to remember is a scream is not very far away from a laugh. I'm just recovering, looking in the window of a shop selling all things Gothic. And really, Gothic has taken over Whitby. Looking in this window, there's lamps made out of skulls, there's snakes, there's dragons. It should be frightening, but actually, it's quite appealing. Well, I calmed down by climbing back up those 199 steps to the graveyard and the beautiful Georgian Gothic church of St Mary's. There I met the Reverend Graham Taylor, who was until recently the vicar here. Graham is the author of Shadowmancer, a truly fantastic Gothic adventure for children. The classic Gothic divide between good and evil is at the core of Shadowmancer, and in an audacious move, Graham bequeathed the novel's villain Demerol his own job as Vicar of Whitby. I asked Graham what had drawn him to the Gothic.
There seems to be a need and a desire within people to explore and experience the dark side. As a teenager, I was involved in the fashion side of goth, which was dressing up in black and wearing Doc Marten boots and wearing black eye makeup, which I still quite fancy today. And now, as a priest, I still dress in black.
Yes.
I remember when I was in Whitby, I was coming back down from the churchyard, walking through the town in my cloak and my cassock. And it was the weekend of the goth weekend. And I had so many admiring glances and people coming up saying, "Can I buy your cloak from you?" thinking I was a goth, which was quite a compliment, really.
That's fantastic, because I think it's partly a safe way to explore these dark places that you were talking about, to explore it through literature and through music.
I think it's people catering to their alter egos and catering to this need within themselves to explore things which are darker. And also there's a great deal of excitement within the Gothic culture about what they're doing and what they're reading and what they're listening to. And there is a very sexual element as well within their dress and a lot of the bondage gear that they wear. And if you've been in the Gothic weekend here in Whitby and go into the main event, you'll see, maybe 2,000 young women dressed in black basques and suspenders, which for some men can be quite a nice thing to see. So there is this, I think there's this deep, dark experimentation.
Sure.
But meet them on a Sunday morning when they come into church, and many Goths do come to church, and you'll find that they're bank managers and clerks and solicitors and, you know, all these wonderful professions, and it's people experimenting with a different culture.
That's great. So it's not an unsuitable genre for a vicar in that case?
No, not really. We had a service in church one Friday afternoon of the Goth weekend, and we had 400 Goths turn up. And it was wonderful. We had 2 Sun reporters as well, who tried to, this is the great thing, is that they tried to dress as Goths, but it was spot the Sun reporter. You could tell who they were because this vicar was putting on service for Goths, so they wanted to make something of it.
Right.
But we had a fantastic
So you
afternoon.
did get the undesirable elements after
We got
all.
the undesirable element in, definitely.
In Shadowmancer, I think that the villains that we have are most definitely villains. We're not going to mistake them for anything else. I think sometimes in Gothic in general, though, the villains can be quite attractive, can't they? If we think of Dracula, people seem to enjoy the experience of being vamping, standing in for sex.
Well, if you look at Dracula, who wouldn't want a 6-foot tall, muscular, black-haired guy sucking on the neck? You know, it's everybody's dream. You know, many men as well would welcome it with open arms. And there is something powerful and mysterious about this man coming and overpowering you. You know, when Dracula bites the neck, he's having it off with her, as one critic once said. And it's true. There is this sort of power trip that can go along in Gothic culture. The sexuality of the pure thing of taking one's blood is such a powerful image. It's actually taking the life force from someone. And within my book, we have the Glashan, who are dressed from head to foot in black leather.
Yes.
And I wanted something powerful, something symbolic. And I didn't want these namby-pamby blooming villains that are literally going throughout children's literature, which to me are a bit, you know, wet. I get sick of people representing Satan as being this ugly, horrendous beast.
Sure.
I wanted Satan to be sexy and to be good looking and to be witty and to be so charming.
Yeah, I think if I was to try and make a recipe for a Gothic place, I couldn't come up with somewhere better than Whitby.
Ah, but the best time is at midnight on Halloween, when you are surrounded by at least 1,000 Goths, and the wind is blowing and there is a full moon, and you look around and see all these white fangs and teeth, and you think to yourself, will I get out of here alive?
Well, we wish you luck for next Halloween.
I don't go anymore. I'm too frightened.
Graham told me that Whitby's Halloween Gothic weekend organises collections for the Cats Protection League and the Bats Conservation Trust. This information endeared me to Goths, so I decided to meet some real ones. I tracked down Paul and Matt from the band Corrosion at a pub in London's Farringdon, where they were playing to a cellar full of beautiful Goths.
Where the roses sown frustration ripples through the ground, nailed into a box and a prayer of broken hearts.
For me personally, Gothic is very much to do with the music. It's to do with the musical style. Initially, the Gothic sound came out of the punk movement in the late 70s, and the very early forms of music out of punk were bands like Joy Division, Bauhaus, The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, and the sort of Gothic sound that we have now originated from those sort of bands. And you've got the fashion, the image, and everything else that goes with it. It's something that you live your life with.
I think some of the names that Gothic bands have are amazing, really, and things like Corrosion and concerned with decay in a way that literature is as well, decay and death. Do you think that Goths are obsessed with death?
No, I think they're stereotypically looked at as being obsessed by death and blood and gore, and I think
we're not vampires.
A lot of people, you know, there are people that follow the goth scene that do like to have false fangs and wear frock coats, frilly shirts and go out looking like Mr. Pickwick. But, you know, that's just part of the fashion, really.
Sure. I can remember, what was it, Whitby a couple of years ago. I can't remember the name of the band that played, but they were just on the fringes of the scene. And the girl on stage was bouncing about all over the place, shouting, "Come on, you goths, cheer up, let's have a good time." Which was met with a kind of stunned silence, as if to say, well, behave yourself. I mean, we come here, we have a good time, we bounce about, and we like it, you know. We're not all sitting in a corner moping about. No, we like to have a good time, just like everyone else.
So you don't enjoy being miserable, in other words?
No, I don't.
No, the goth scene's too fun to be miserable.
You were talking about clothes, and I wondered, what would a typical goth wear?
Black.
Black.
Purple. Things that are striking that your average, everyday Joe wouldn't wear.
At the end of the day, we all want to look fabulous, you know, and we just want to do it our way.
So it must make getting ready for an evening an awful lot more fun, really.
If somebody who is a non-goth decides to go out with a goth, they got to expect a 2-hour wait minimum on going out to the pub.
Would you say that Gothic is, or started out at least, as a genre of alienation?
Oh, well, goths have always been objected to by the sort of mass population. Last week there was a whole bunch of us up in York, and we went down to a nightclub and we were turned away for being goths. And we were getting violent gestures from the sort of trendies in the club. It doesn't help when you hear a story on the news like, what was it, the trench coat Columbine thing, and they automatically assume that's what goths do. You know, I mean, I get ribbed out at work. I mean, all right, most people I work with know better. But, you know, as soon as something like that happens, you know full well it's let's blame the goths again, because they're the weird people that you don't see in the street very often.
The band have struck a chord with their image of alienation at the centre of Gothic. It's certainly a genre that attracts extremes. One of the earliest Gothic texts, Matthew Lewis's The Monk, was so outrageous Lewis was in danger of prosecution. Indeed, in modern times, one librarian allegedly underlined all the rude passages so readers would know which bits to avoid. I asked Patrick McGrath, recently described as the best Gothic novelist ever, is it possible for Gothic to be politically correct?
I'd say that's probably a contradiction in I think the Gothic would be appalled at the thought of ever being politically correct at all. Its whole justification for existing is to subvert. And political correctness is the very reverse of that.
Yeah.
So, you know, give it some sort of conventional standard of behaviour or morality and whatever, and the Gothic is always eager to find the ways in which you can turn it around, destroy it, undo it, tear away its facade and show the sort of the dark, throbbing monstrousness within.
And of course, no medium does that better than film. Professor David Punter of the University of Bristol is the author of many books on Gothic, including the seminal text, The Literature of Terror.
Some of the very earliest films had to do with the creation of ghostly effects, and it could be argued, and some people have argued, that film itself is ghostly. That film itself, and certainly in the early days, when you read reports by viewers of those very early films, shortly after film had come into being, they were stunned. They were saying, we are seeing here pictures of people who are not here. Indeed, possibly sometimes people who are dead. But they're still here, mysteriously. They are mysteriously present, and so they are, in a way, again, revenants. So the whole practice of film can be seen as a practice which revives the dead, which revitalises that which has passed.
Mark Evans' recent film, My Little Eye, is set in a classic Gothic location, a decaying old mansion in the middle of nowhere. But in a modern twist, the young inhabitants of the house are part of a live web broadcast. They're constantly under video surveillance. It's this footage that comprises the film, so in a sense it's us, the viewers, who haunt the increasingly frightened cast.
Now I suddenly feel all on display. I hate this house. Take cover! Creepy ass house. Hello, can anybody hear me? Please.
You guys don't have to worry. You're much more likely to be killed by somebody you know.
Mark has just shot another film in the Gothic tradition, Trauma, which sounds spine-chillingly good. He took me to Trauma's main location, Gilbert Scott's St Pancras Hotel on London's Euston Road. It's an amazing example of Victorian Gothic architecture. Red brick, embellished with yellow stone, punctuated by hundreds of pointy windows and topped with turrets. Inside are elaborately painted walls and ceilings. But instead of leading me up the towering ironwork staircase, Mark took me down several flights of dingy steps.
This area here we're in, you can hear the tubes in the background, something rattling above our heads. It's probably the kitchens or the service area for the hotel. But inevitably, in a Gothic horror film, we used it as the cellar in which there was the old morgue. The whole film, trauma, is set in a converted hospital or a disused hospital, and it had to have a morgue, and this is where the morgue was, and we had the names of the deceased who were assigned into the morgue chalked onto these walls, which kind of added to the general atmosphere. There were stories like there was a flood here once, and this manhole in which we're standing actually popped up, and about 500 rats ran from this manhole and then ran down that manhole. So actually shooting down here for the best part of 2 weeks did kind of engender that sense of dread that comes with Gothic architecture.
I've just taken a sharp step back and I'm no longer standing on the manhole. The shades of Nosferatu.
Yeah.
Do you think buildings like this, Mark, are really important in filmmaking? When we think about other Gothic or horror movies like Psycho and The Shining, and in your previous film, My Little Eye, where an old house really does figure at the centre of the film, why do you think it's so unsettling?
I think there's two things really. One is that you're always trying to subvert the familiar. It's like the old country song, this house is not a home, and in a sense, the house, a benign house, should be a home where a functional family lives. But in horror, the house turns against the inhabitants in a way that during childhood, in every corner and every bed, something lurks. And I think that's part of the thing. And then, of course, with Gothic revivalist architecture like this kind of architecture was kind of engendered the whole Gothic sense of dread, and that's why I think it's got a bad name, because classical architecture is about the humane and the rational and the light and the efficient, and Gothic architecture as we know it here, in other words, Victorian Gothic revival architecture, you go, well, it's not such a great place to be, it's quite a scary feel to it, just being here.
Do you think in Gothic, a lot of the time we've got an awareness of being watched, that unnerving feeling? You mentioned these corridors, and there could be somebody just standing at your shoulder.
I mean, in a funny sort of way, the challenge is a very simple one, and that is it still possible to make grown-ups scared? Because it is about that area that, of childhood and madness and loneliness that you do experience in a very extreme way when you're younger, or at least if you're a certain kind of child you do. And the idea of going mad, of losing it, is actually of that door creaking open in your consciousness and all that stuff coming back in again. And I think if you can get an audience to that place, that's the challenge, really. Yeah. You get it right, you get the tone right, and it's very cathartic for the audience, because you go, I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like to be haunted by my own dreams, or to be scared at night, or to feel like I'm going mad.
I think it's a delicious feeling for the audience, though, when they're trembling on that feeling of terror and thinking, oh God, this is all going to go horribly wrong, but I don't know when and I don't know how. And I must say, I watched My Little Lie for the second time at the weekend, and I watched it on video this time, and I had to get my friend to go and check that the door was locked, because there was no way that I could go and check that the door was locked, because that would mean leaving the sitting room. In My Little Lie, as we said, the young people are being observed all the time. It's like a Big Brother scenario. It's kind of what I kept on hoping would happen in Big Brother, actually. You wanted one of them to go crazy and murder the rest and let us all off the hook, really. But it's to me, a lot about fears of technology, which I think, again, are a constant in Gothic film and literature, and thinking about something like Frankenstein or Jekyll and Hyde, where scientists are overreaching all the time. Do you think this is a constant, the fears of science and new technology?
Each generation of film kind of expresses the fears of that generation, I think Rosemary's Baby is about birth control, really, It's not for me to say that, but it's a film that seems to be fueled by that kind of theme. And there's a fear, for example, now, I think, which is quite irrational amongst rational people, of the web, that if I put my credit card into the web, I don't know who's going to get my credit card number. Well, but you could be forgiven for having that fear. And if I sign up with a website by filling in a form in a supermarket in Idaho, where that journey might end might be completely sinister, and I might be vulnerable to powers that I don't understand.
I don't know, I was just thinking, a supermarket in Idaho sounds like a really Gothic space to me. But do you think that the web itself is a Gothic space? It's huge, it's labyrinthine, we don't know what's in there, really, and it's new.
You're here, your little nodal point of connection is here, but beyond you there's this kind of rather frightening Gothic space of corridors and corners and enclaves is very good. I mean, jungle, wilderness also applies. It's definitely a Gothic fear, that, isn't it?
Yeah, we don't know who's going to contact us.
No, exactly.
They're out there. Gothic is usually associated with the past, so I'm delighted that it's finding fresh labyrinths to haunt in our new technologies, but I'm still concerned that as society becomes more permissive, this most sensationalist of genres will be left without any taboos to break. I asked Sarah Waters, whose best-selling novels include Fingersmith and Affinity, what she thought lay in store for the Gothic.
Writing my Gothic novels, I went naturally to the 19th century, this time before the rise of electricity, you know, when things were physically a lot gloomier, for example, and you could talk about, in very real terms, this, you know, light and darkness and the tension between them. Certainly as our society is becoming more comfortable in talking more explicitly about sex and the body and madness and stuff like that, it does make you wonder where sort of the Gothic can go next, or what form the Gothic can take next. But I think society can become frank and permissive, but there are still going to be sort of anxieties under the surface, and in a way, you know, they just throw out more anxieties. I mean, the fact that women now are expected to be, I don't know, or have all their hair plucked out, you know what I mean, and be sort of they're not allowed to sweat, and you know what I mean, they've got to be kind of in control of their bodies, and they've got to be kind of muscular. I mean, in a sense, it just provides all this extra stuff about anxiety about the body.
Yeah. So, as I neared the end of my quest, I asked David Punter if we can ever come close to a definition of the Gothic.
No, I don't think we can. There are several reasons for that. The first one, I suppose, is that Gothic, I think, is endlessly remaking itself in different forms and in different ways. The second reason would be that, of course, it's a term, although we've talked largely about literature, is relevant in a number of other fields as well, so that from the medieval Gothic cathedrals, one goes through to Gothic fiction and then on to the Victorian Gothic revival and out of Goth culture and so forth. So we have a whole series of remakings. But all of those remakings are, I think, parts of a search for a different version of history. I think that what the Gothic appears to have stood for the last 300 years or so is a search for a version of history which is different from the official one. Gothic has got something to do with a notion of history from which things do not pass away, a notion of history whereby things are still there in some sense, even if they cannot be fully admitted to, or even if they can't be fully seen when you look at them head on. I think Gothic is a kind of peripheral vision in a way. It's the things that you don't see when you look directly at something, but things you know are there, the shadows, the dreams, the nightmares, the odd things which are haunting the corners of your eyes.
My journey has finally led me back to the beginning, to Strawberry Hill in Twickenham, home of Horace Walpole and birthplace of British Gothic literature. It isn't a very Gothic-sounding name, Strawberry Hill, but it's hard to think of a more appropriate location to end our quest. This is a fantastic place. Horace began building his little Gothic castle in 1750 and continued to improve it into the mid-1770s. Walpole was a true innovator, but in the Gothic tradition he borrowed features and designs from the grandest cathedrals, then adapted them to suit the smaller scale of Strawberry Hill. I'm in Horace's favourite room, the library. The bookcases in this room are based on the screen from Old St Paul's. The staircase is from Rouen Cathedral, and the amazing fan vault in the dining room is taken from Westminster Abbey, only this one is made from papier-mâché. Sleeping here, it's hardly surprising that Horace had Gothic dreams. So was born the Castle of Otranto, the first novel we think of as Gothic. Look at any horror movie and you'll see echoes of Otranto. Huge haunted houses, atmospheric weather, endless scenes of flight, I could go on. It's fascinating to realise that more than 200 years later, the same things still disturb us. And I think this is the key discovery that I've made on this quest. Gothic says something fundamental about the human condition. Long before Freud identified the subconscious, Gothic provided a means of exploring nameless hopes and dreads, sexual anxiety, feelings of alienation. And here, in British Gothic's birthplace, the adaptability of the Gothic becomes clear. It's a genre that's ever-changing and ever-constant, continually referencing the past, and yet has its sights set firmly on the future.